Can you all hear me? So it's a great pleasure to be here, actually, and I'm humbled to be up here and talk about Francis Hamilton. You should know that Francis Hamilton has close links, close ties to the Linnean Society because he was friends with John Edward Smith, the founder of the Linnean Society. They studied together in Edinburgh, and they had quite a frequent and intense exchange. They sent letters back and forth, which back then meant you had to wait for at least a couple of weeks until you got the reply. But still, they communicated all the time. He was stationed in India. And I will show some of the letters that they wrote because they contain interesting information that's pertinent to this problem. And the Linnean Society has all these original letters in their collections. So you will notice that it says the Natural History Museum and Sammlung in Dresden. So this means that I, not that long ago, left the Natural History Museum, and this is my new place. So I moved back to Germany, and that's where I work now. So I'm also delighted to come back to what I consider my old territory. So let's start. Before we really start with the talk, I want to point out that the area where Hamilton worked is now considered one of the most important, globally most important biodiversity hotspots. So it's up there in the north of India, adjacent Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, and Myanmar. And there are more species in this small area than in most other parts of the world. I did most of my fieldwork actually in Myanmar. And between the mid-90s until recently, I've done 10 different expeditions to different parts of Myanmar, and I collected different fishes. That's Oliver Crimmen here, a colleague of mine. And when you collect fishes in Myanmar, ultimately, you're faced with this incredible diversity, and you have to ask yourself, so how does this compare to the Indian fauna? So you can't really avoid getting at some point in touch with this work, Francis Hamilton's Gangetic Fishes. So the actual title is An Account of the Fishes Found in the River Ganges and Its Branches. And this is a photo of my own copy, which I got when I was a student still in Tübingen, because I like to collect old books. And back then, this cost me a month's salary, but still, I'm very proud that I got a copy. So what is an account of the fishes of the Ganges? Hamilton covered 272 different freshwater and brackish water species that he found over the time he was stationed in India. And he provided, so these are on something like 405 pages, detailed descriptions of the different species. And he illustrated them on 39 plates. But as you can see, 272 species, but only 97 species were actually illustrated. And we get to that in a moment, why that is. Now, after publication of Hamilton's monographic, gigantic work, Georges Cuvier, who was one of the leading anatomists, in addition to Richard Owen here, French anatomist, he said about this publication, it's the finest contribution to ichthyology ever received from distant lands. And that's quite a compliment because Cuvier himself, together with Valenciennes, another French colleague, ichthyologist, they published a 22-volume treatise on the fishes that were known at that time. So if he praises Hamilton, that does mean something. And 100 years later, Sundarlal Hora, an eminent Indian ichthyologist, said something similar about Hamilton. There's no work of greater importance than An Account of the Fishes found in the River Ganges by Francis Hamilton for the student of Indian freshwater fishes. So a very, very important work. And you would think, well, it's published, that's the end of it, but it isn't at all. Because there's this very, very interesting little bit in the draft that Hamilton sent to the printers, but it wasn't printed. And if I can read it out to you, I have to regret that the number of plates is so small, owing to my having been deprived of the drawings of 144 fishes. These, together with drawings of 20 quadrupeds, 241 birds, and of 130 plants, the government of Bengal, at the instigation of the Earl of Moira, took from me by one of those mean exertions of power into which a weak man thrust into high authority is liable to fall. So that's already an interesting piece, but he was much more vocal and critical in his personal communication with Smith. And this is worth reading too. Before I left India, that vain, empty creature, Lord Moira, seized on all the drawings of natural history which had been made by the painters attached to the statistical survey, although I had applied for leave to carry them home to be presented to the court of directors. This has interfered much with my views of publishing, especially a history of the Gangetic fishes. The directors, it is true, have ordered the drawings to be sent home immediately, but what the animal may do with them in the interim, it is difficult to say. So that is the animal up there, Lord Moira. Right. Now, various aspects of the life of Hamilton have been covered by a long, pretty comprehensive biography by Prain, and recently Watson, Mark Watson, and Henry Nolte, where is he? Can he find? Wrote kind of a fresh new biography, looking at different aspects that Prain didn't cover. So I'm not going to talk about the early life of Hamilton, because that's covered there. Just the basic facts you need to know, so that what I will tell you later makes sense. Right. So Hamilton was born in 1762. So this was the start of the Enlightenment. So he could be counted as part of the Scottish Enlightenment. And he was born as Francis Buchanan. And why that is, and why he changed his name, I can tell you later. So he was born here in central Scotland on the estate of Bardowie, and he started to study at university in Glasgow, then got a medical degree in Edinburgh, and he died not far from where he was born on the Linnean estate. But you would think this is all very close to each other, but he spent the better part of 20 years as a surgeon, assistant surgeon in the beginning, attached to the East India Company in India, in what was called the Bengal Presidency mostly. And back then, the British Empire controlled a very, very large part of India and what is now also Bangladesh. So he was traveling in this area, and he paid two very long visits to India. The first one between 1794 and 1805, that's 11 years, and another very intense one, second visit, where he surveyed a much larger area between 1807 and 15. Now, Hamilton did leave Britain in May 1794, and back then, if you wanted to go to India, it took you almost 6 months to arrive. And right after he arrived, he was actually sent on a mission to what is now part of Myanmar, of Burma, to the kingdom of Ava. And he mainly, because he was mostly and foremost initially a trained botanist, he mainly collected plants at that time. So no fish yet. But after that, he was stationed here at the mouth of the Meghna, which is one of the biggest rivers in this part of the world. He was stationed in Lakipur, and his residence was a little further north in Putahat. And this is where I actually started to get interested in fishes, because I think at some point you do get bored if you just work on plants, no offense. And you look for what could be considered more interesting things that move around, right? So fishes in this mouth of the river are the obvious thing to look at. So that's what he says there. His time was much occupied in describing the fishes of the country. But he couldn't just look at fish and plants, because he was called upon again to do another journey to survey an area, an adjacent area, the Chittagong Hills in today's Bangladesh. After Lakipur, he was stationed in Baripur, which is now really closer to the action, because Lakipur was kind of a backwater. So Baripur is was still a small place, but it wasn't far from Calcutta. And you have the Hoogly River nearby. So he continued to look at fishes, describe them, and had them illustrated. And by 1799, and we know that because he wrote a letter to Smith, and he included 10 drawings of these fishes, which we call cyprinid fishes, carp relatives. He included 10 of them and sent them to London, to Smith. And you can actually look at these in the display upstairs, because they're part of the Linnean collection, these beautiful drawings. But of course, you had to send them back by ship, so they were taken on the ship, the Duke of Montrose, back to London. And I'm going to use this to explain Hamilton's way of having these illustrated, working with them, looking at them. So he always shows a species in a lateral view, colored. Sandy said that the published book is only a monochrome etchings. So there's color information in the originals. And he had the ingenious way of showing a dorsal view, which helps you understand what the fish looks like. Is it a laterally flattened one? Is it a dorsal ventrally flattened one? Is it one that's round in cross-section? So that's really, really ingenious. And it's Hamilton who kind of invented that. And then he would have the Bengali name in Bengali language and an English transliteration. So non-Bengali speakers could actually pronounce this name. And then he had a Latin species name, Octodecim striatus, the 18 rayed fish. But again, he was called to a different part of India to do another survey, because the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War had just ended, and Britain had occupied a very large part of Mysore, which is used to be this big area in the south of India. And he was sent there to, of course, East India Company. They wanted to know what kind of resources are there that could be extracted, exploited. So he covered all kinds of resources, but he also had the chance to collect 3 species of fishes. And he described them, because his report was published in 1807. So this is actually his first fish publication, although he already had these 10 cyprinids illustrated and sent to London, but they weren't published then. And then again, he was called off to a different part of northern India, Nepal. He went on a mission to Nepal, which lasted almost 1.5 years. And there, he wasn't able to collect any fishes, because he said the Nepalese aren't really interested in fishes. They don't catch them. They don't know what lives in their rivers. So just plants, unfortunately, or fortunately for some. We do know, though, that by early 1800, Hamilton had finished a larger manuscript describing 78 species of fishes. And they were accompanied by the same number of drawings. We know that. And he mentions this actually in a letter he wrote from Nepal, from Basaria, on the 3rd March of 1802. So these were done before he left for Nepal. And he said, I've left a number of drawings and descriptions of fishes with my good friend, Mr. Fleming. He was the president of the medical board, a very great encourager and promoter of the study of natural history. If he should go home before my return to Bengal, and that's what happened, he will take them with him and endeavor to get them published. But this actually never happened. So there was a manuscript describing 78 fishes, thought to get published, but it was never published. Fleming then left India on the 24th Christmas of 1802 and arrived 6 months later. We don't really know what happened to the manuscript. We didn't know until in 1931, this Australian ichthyologist asked a colleague who went to London to get him a copy of Hamilton's 2-volume monograph. And this friend of his went to different booksellers, and one of them was Weldon and Wesley, and they were still active when I was a student, so they still ran a business of secondhand books until the, I think, 1990s. But his friend couldn't find a copy of Hamilton's book. But what Weldon and Wesley had was a manuscript of Hamilton's. And this manuscript is actually the lost 1800 manuscript. And because he had just read a paper by this Indian gentleman, which I introduced before, about Hamilton's fishes of the Ganges, he knew that this was an important piece of evidence, so he sent it straight to Hora, and Hora wrote a paper about it. And it's from this paper that we can gather interesting additional information. This 1800 manuscript is still in India, and it's in the Asiatic Society of Bengal in the library. And Mark Watson, who saw it with his own eyes, told me that it doesn't quite look as bad as this. So this is a Xerox copy that an ichthyologist colleague of mine with the name of Tyson Roberts got made when he was in India and saw this manuscript. So in actuality, it doesn't look as bad, because this is water damage from the big flood in Calcutta in the 1940s. Right, so this is entirely written in Latin. Do you want me to translate that? I think you can. The fishes of Lower Bengal, with descriptions of 87 of them, 78 of them, 78. So the question is, what really happened to this manuscript between 1802, when Fleming left with it, we assume he had it, and then the 1931, when this friend of Whitley's, the Australian ichthyologist, found it at the Linnean. We still don't know. And we don't know where the plates went. But there's another really interesting piece of information that we can gather from this 1800 manuscript, and that's the introduction, which was written by Hamilton, included in the publication by Hora, and it's now missing from this original manuscript, this page. But Hora had it, and he published the paper, so we know a little bit about it. And most importantly, we know who drew all these beautiful drawings of fishes. It was an artist called Haludar. And he's probably responsible for the drawings, all the drawings in the Gangetic fishes, because they have the same style, same kind of hand, I think, drew them. So a very important young man back then, and completely ignored his contribution until recently. A colleague of mine, the Sri Lankan ichthyologist Rohan Pethiagoda, actually named a new genus of fishes from India after him, Haludaria, to honor his contribution. So after his time in Baripur, Hamilton moved to Barakpur, which was an interesting place because this gentleman, he was the highest official in the East India Company in Bengal. Governor General is his title, Richard Wellesley. He was fascinated by animals and plants too. And he had this menagerie, you would call it a zoo these days, I guess, of animals, exotic animals from all across India. He was very well liked, very well connected, and people sent him animals alive, and he would exhibit them in, these kind of cages. So So it was a well-known spot. And he put Hamilton in charge of it. And this also came with a whole team of artists. So Hamilton spent a lot of time training these artists, having them draw on every single animal that came to the menagerie. So from that time, we have not only illustrations of fishes and plants, they're also, we would call them tetrapods, reptiles, amphibians, mammals, and birds. Beautiful drawings. And some of them are by Halodar. And if you put Halodar and Barrackpore into Google, you get this hit here. You can buy prints for £116, or you can go to the original source, the British Library, because they have this set, and buy them for 15. Right. After that, that's where his first visit really ended, and Hamilton went back with Wellesley, who was called back from his duties in India. He went back to London and arrived there in January 1806. But because he had so successfully performed these surveys, the board of directors of the East India Company wanted him to do another really big survey, the survey of the Bengal presidency. And I'm going to show this map repeatedly now. That is what was called the Bengal presidency, which is basically a large part of today's Bangladesh, all of northern India, and bordering then Nepal and Bhutan. So he arrived in June 1807, and by December he was already in the field surveying. And now maybe I put in a couple of slides about the way he worked, because it was so different from how other ichthyologists worked at his time. This is also a bit of information we got from his 1800 manuscript, the one that went missing for a long time. And this explains really the difference. I've striven to figure in its natural colors every fish that came before me, indeed while they were still alive in the water. And my description has always been the result of my personal examination of a recently captured specimen. A result, and he knew that, which few ichthyologists writing on the fishes of India have been able to obtain. And I'll illustrate the big difference by showing this fish. Now that's an Indian fish. That's Macrognathus aculeatus, described by Martin Elisa Bloch, a pharmacist who lived in Berlin. He was very wealthy, very interested in natural history objects, especially fishes, and he had bought this large collection, which is still in Berlin, of exotic fishes. And that's a drawing of one of the specimens, because they were sent in spirit. And that is an actual Bloch specimen from the 1780s. That's what it looks like. And it didn't look very different back then. Maybe it lost a little bit of color. That's Hamilton's drawing of the same or a similar species, because he used living fishes in the water. And this is a photo I took in Calcutta a couple of years ago of that very same species. And it's incredible how accurate his drawings are, down to the number of fin rays and fin spines. Even the posture, because that's a typical posture of this is called a spiny eel in an aquarium. It just curves its tail a little. It didn't up there because it didn't have a lot of space in the photo tank. And this is what his drawings and the accompanying field notes looked like. So every time he encountered a new species, he had his artist draw it. He probably supervised and corrected the drawings. And then he wrote up in Latin a description. And he took these field notes with him when he traveled, because he added to them. So for example, the initial local name was Kutkutia. And then in Guapara, where he went much later, it's called Tempa, and so on and so on. He just kept adding to his notes. Now this is a typical note page of notes from his first visit. Because he was only stationed in 3 places, I think he didn't find it necessary to add a locality. And there's no date. Later, during the second visit, the Big Bengal survey, he would always add the place and the date. Almost always, that is. And then this is the description. And then here in English, which is not very frequent, he adds some notes later. We do know from a publication from 1826 that he traveled to these different parts of northern India. These were the 3 places he worked before, so he went up there. But if you look at these field notes, the places and the dates, you get actually a much better, more complete picture of where he was when. So he traveled to the Brahmaputra part, then strangely down again, and then up the Ganges to different tributaries, and further up the Jamuna and back down again, and then up the Ganges to different places, and then back to Calcutta. And then shortly after he went back, so this is a period of 8 years, he went back to Britain. Interestingly, this is something I've found, all these original drawings, which are, I get to that in a moment, which are preserved, which we had access to, they have a number written on the upper right corner, 23 in this case. And this number links the drawing to the field note. But more interestingly, also to the notes in the 1800 manuscript. So these 3 sources, just by looking at these numbers, can be easily linked, because this was the 23rd species he discovered. Now, 2 localities stand out because they appear more often than any other locality in his notes. And that's Goalpara on the Brahmaputra and Nagpur on the Kosi. And I'm going to talk about a couple of fish he described. On the 2nd of August in 1810, he made a discovery that if he had known what impact this would have, he would have felt very strange. He discovered Danurario, the zebrafish, one of the most important lab animals we use today, a model for vertebrate development. That's his drawing, and that's the actual fish, the zebrafish. So if you put zebrafish into Google Scholar, you get 888,000 hits if you don't restrict the years. Just this year, you get 17,900. So a very important animal in developmental genetics, even today, and all kinds of research. Now, guess what happens if you put Hamilton? Through all the years, you just get 3,350 hits. So if Hamilton, who discovered this fish that's now so important, would be cited every time that somebody publishes a paper on zebrafish, he would probably be one of the most cited authors in biology. The way Hamilton chose his names is quite interesting, because initially he almost always derived them from Latin words. Right? Levis means not naked, not smooth, yes. Punctatum, with spots. Bidentatus, the two-tooth. Vagabundus, the wandering around. And Bimaculatus, the two-spotted. But during the Bengal survey, his second visit to India, he changed that. Almost all the fishes he described then, he named after local names. So Chana Barka, because that's the local name for this fish, Barka, and that's the Bengali name. He even went back to the original Latin names and changed a lot of them. So this was still not published, right? So he could do it. So this Tetradon levis, he called Tetradon kutkutia, because that's the local name in Bengal for it. And he did that with lots and lots of species. He even, when he erected a new genus, he would choose a local name. Now, what about Hamilton as a fish taxonomist? Well, he had the big advantage that he was the first one to actually encounter this huge diversity. So most of what he saw was new. So of the 272 species, he considered 259 as new. The others he knew were already described by some of his colleagues. But out of these, about 180, or that's 70% of the species he described, are still today, 200 years after he published his work, are still valid. So this means he had a very, very good eye for what is a new species and what are different species. But also, now having access to these colored illustrations, probably several species that are now synonymized need to be revalidated. And this is a blatant example. That's the black and white published figure of these two species. And this is what they look like in color. So two very, very different fish. This fish also has an interesting story. That is Chanabaka, the name I showed you before. Chanabaka is snakehead fish. That's the black and white published drawing. And when you read the Indian literature, you read that it occurs in West Bengal, Assam, Bangladesh, inhabits large rivers. And here, that's the most recent treaty of freshwater fishes in India. It's fairly common. But actually, that's not true, because based on that black and white drawing, this fish has been confused with another one. And this is the color drawing, which is also on the cover of the dust jacket of the book. And this species, Hamilton says, only occurs near Goalpara, where it inhabits perpendicular banks in holes dug like those of the marten. So a very, very specific way of life. And it was quite a sensation when in 2005, photos like this were sent around on the web among aquarists, and people said, what is this? Now that's a very, very, very clear depiction of what Chanabaka looks like, and that is Chanabaka. The interesting part is it's a very rare fish. So in 2005, the first pair was imported into the UK, and it was sold for £5,000 to Japan, to someone in Japan. And still, these fish, Chanabaka, sell for at least $1,000 in the trade. It's one of the most expensive aquarium fish you can get. Now, I said that Hamilton was very good at distinguishing what is a new species and what is not. He made some very obvious mistakes, but obvious only to us, not to him. So he described these two species, these two fish as two species, Trichogaster tuna and Trichogaster sota. They look very different, absolutely. But what he didn't know, they're just the male and the female of the same species. And he couldn't know because he didn't keep them. If he had, he would have seen that they spawn together and reproduce. So there are a few cases like that where you have an extreme sexual dimorphism, sexual dichromatism, that he just interpreted as different species. So it's pretty clear from what I said that Hamilton's field notes, which are preserved in the British Library, these beautiful handwritten, mostly in Latin, notes, and Hamilton's drawings, which the original set that was used for his 1822 monograph, the published one, are in the British Library also. So it's pretty clear these are very important sources of information that we thought we need to make available. So we started to gather all the sets. If you remember, Hamilton complained that he had to leave 144 illustrations back in India. And as it turns out, he never got them. That's why he only illustrated his monograph with 97 species drawings. Now, these are some of the originally, the drawings originally sent to the Linnean Society, and only 9 are still preserved. The 10th one, we don't really know what happened to it, but it wasn't there when Hora in 1929 looked at them. So it probably would disappear, was lost much, much earlier. And then we have what I would call the Hamilton set, which is the one in the British Library. That's actually 104, not just 97 that he illustrated. So he had 7 more than he actually used. And this is probably because even etching, making illustrations, was expensive. And there were all kinds of problems associated with the printing, which I can't go into detail about. But he only illustrated 97 of them. And then there is the Hardwick set. Now that is very interesting. Hardwick was a general with the East India Company, and he just loved natural history drawings, and he collected them. And when he left India, came back to Britain, at some point he bequeathed his entire collection, which is 37 big folio volumes, hundreds, thousands of natural history drawings, to the British Library. And they eventually came to the Natural History Museum. So they are there, preserved. And interestingly enough, they contain copies of almost every single species that Hamilton had drawn during his Bengal survey and had to leave behind. So by combining these two sources, mainly the one in the British Library and the one in the Natural History Museum, we were able to cover more than 90% of the illustrated species. Now, the Hardwick set is not without controversy. So that is General Hardwick, and he was a close friend of this gentleman, John Edward Gray, who worked at the Natural History Museum. And he used Hardwick's drawings to publish a two-volume monograph called Illustrations of Indian Zoology. And these illustrations of Indian zoology contain some of Hamilton's drawings without actually acknowledging the source. So when McClelland, another surgeon associated with the East India Company, found out about this, he was furious, and he accused Hardwick of plagiarism. But Richardson then explained that actually Hamilton and Hardwick were close friends, and these copies in the Hardwick collection were made with the consent of Hamilton. So the real culprit is probably Gray. Because and if you look at the Hardwick collection, you see that every time he had a copy of a Hamilton drawing, he actually acknowledged it. He wrote Hamilton Buchanan, but not Gray, who published the monograph. Yeah, this is just a little compilation I did, just part of a big table where I compared the different sources. And so this illustrates in blue the British Library's set, and no, it's the other way around. In yellow, the British Library set, and in blue, the Hardwick set. And you can see that they are mutually exclusive, because the Hardwick set is mostly second visit drawings, whereas the Hamilton set is mostly first visit drawings. And then there were some species that weren't in either set. Why, I don't know. They weren't copied by Hardwick. But they were published by McClelland, another ichthyologist who worked in India. So we had to use 3 of his published drawings, and he acknowledged Hamilton as the source. And then, interestingly, at some point when we were working on this, I got an email from Anne Sylph, who's the librarian at the Zoological Society, and she said, we have this volume of drawings by Francis Day, another Indian important ichthyologist who worked in India, British ichthyologist. And there seemed to be some Hamilton drawings among them. And it turns out there were 2 drawings by Hamilton that were in no other set. So we were quite lucky that we got those 2. And then for 2 species, we just couldn't find a color drawing anywhere, and we had to include the black and white drawings, which were published by Hora. So combining all these, we published just recently. Hamilton's Gangetic Fishes in Color. And I think it's about time that this happened, because really a lot of the credit he should get, he never did get. And McClelland, again, had something to say about this. He said, in deciding that Buchanan's papers should be retained in India, it may be presumed that the object was that they should here be rendered more useful to the country than they could be in England. It could scarcely have occurred to the Marquis of Hastings, that's Lord Moira, the animal, that these works would be consigned to oblivion and the author, in consequence, superseded by his successors. And he then suggested, but as the case stands, perhaps the best remedy that can now be applied in justice to Buchanan, Hamilton, as well as to others who are still engaged in scientific pursuits, would be to give a complete edition of his labors, botanical and zoological, to the public. And that's what we try to do, at least with Gangetic Fishes. And these are my colleagues, Paul Clark and Nick Evans, that's Oliver Crimmen from the Natural History Museum, and the Race Society, who were key in getting this book published. And just today, I'm very, very happy to announce that his original field notes, which are in the British Library, which we just couldn't reprint them because there are more than 400 pages of notes. We just showed 4 that illustrate the different periods that he collected in India in the reprints. But all of these have now been scanned and made available. And just today I got an email from Alex saying they are done, they are online, and these are the URLs. So now they're finally available to the world, ready to study, if you know Latin. And with that, I get to the end of my talk. I'm really, really deeply indebted to the Race Society, because for a very long time, years really, they were extremely supportive of the project. And whenever it got stuck somewhere, then it was Paul and Nick and Ollie also helped to make it unstuck. And then, of course, this would not have been possible without the British Library giving us permission to reproduce them, actually allowing us to get them on loan to the Natural History Museum to have them photographed professionally. So thanks to especially John Falconer, who was the librarian at that time. Then, of course, the Natural History Museum with the Hardwick collection, and there was Paul Cooper, who really was instrumental in making these available. Then, of course, the Linnean Society. Gina, she hand-carried the 9 drawings to the Natural History Museum to have them photographed and carried them back. So a big thank you to her. Where are you? There. And Linda, she carried some, at a later time, a later date, some of the handwritten letters between Hamilton and Smith to be photographed. Of course, Anne Sylph, great that she pointed out to us that there are still some drawings hidden in their collections. Kevin Webb, he was the photographer who took these excellent photos. Then these 3 people are colleagues of mine. They each of them wrote a foreword. So the book has 3 forewords, which some people may think is a little too much, but I think it's not. And then there is this company in Germany who did all the digital layout work. So if you see the drawings, you will see that the actual pages have been cut out. So the frayed edges have been preserved of the originals. That was a lot of work, and so thanks to them. And then Malini, Alex, and Antonia, in discussions recently, said, that sounds like a great idea to make these field notes available. We're going to try and get this done. And as it turns out, they did that today. So thanks. Without them, the 4 kilos of book wouldn't be sitting here. Thank you.